hello to everybody, to our speakers and to you, the audience, and also to give the usual data protection regulation warning that this session is being recorded. My name is Michael Stampfer. I'm the Managing Director of the Vienna Science and Technology Fund, a small private non-profit funding organization, not to be confounded with the Austrian Science Fund, but as we have the president of this organization among us, there will be no problems in confounding anything. Welcome to everybody. This session is called the 3 Fs, Funding, Freedom and Frameworks, and is about the properties and the preconditions of successful, long-term and fruitful academic sustainability. And academic sustainability means that academia is a pillar of our civilization and our societies, and needs special and long-term care and special and long-term preconditions. And this is mainly what we are talking about in these 2 days on the Policy Forum. And those of you who have listened to us yesterday and have participated in discussion have already had already the opportunity to take up a number of interesting points on that, on how academia can thrive in, well, perhaps the times were never easy for universities, but there are good reasons to say that there's a number of growing challenges around. So the overall issue or overall point of this policy forum is, can the academic community respond effectively to these growing demands, whether these demands are rightly pushed forward, and how to preserve the values of scientific freedom and independence also in the future. Most of you, I think all the speakers, but also most of the audience will agree that the high level of autonomy is necessary to fulfill the long-term mission of academic institutions. Self-governance is important. Autonomy is a goal in itself, but also a goal to make universities more useful for the society, for civilization, for the economy, whatever. They can't be just short-term useful and steered organizations. And as the European universities strongly rely on public budgets, a lot of steering instruments have also been developed by public authorities. So it's about balance, it's about sustainability, it's about sustainable financial support, it's about internal institutional structures. And in the last years, increasingly attention, and that's where our speakers will also respond to, between what is called missions or societal needs on the one hand, and on the other hand, the need for curiosity-driven long-term research. And universities somehow have to reconcile these two big needs, and they have to find favorable conditions to reconcile these. Therefore, we speak today about 3 levels. One is the degree of autonomy the state should grant to the universities, and the governance models that then also translate into the second point, the internal structures within the university, power structures, decision structures, and so on, in these expert organizations, which cannot just be compared to other kind of companies or organizations. And the third is, of course, funding, as there are 2 big funding streams, block grants, more and more coupled with indicators or evaluations and other new public management tools, and third-party funding, which is present in different levels in different countries. So if we have a quick UK, Sweden, Austria comparison, Austria might increase the Austrian policy actors might increase the third-party funding to come to a level where the Swedes and the UK, the Brits are. But as we will hear from Sweden, there's also a discussion of potentially too many sources of third-party funding. So this is what we are talking about. I will now present and quickly present the four speakers. First speaker is Ole Petter Ottersen. Ole is the president of the Karolinska Institute, so a top university, a Swedish university, a university with a long tradition, and a specialized university, which might perhaps have easier times in devising strategies than a comprehensive university. And Ole has the big advantages that he has been before the rector of a large comprehensive university. This is the University of Oslo. So Ole's background is by the biomedical research. I hope I don't hurt you if I don't go into detail in that, but you have ample experience also within universities to run centers of excellence and other larger, often third-party funded instruments. I think this is what counts here. The next speaker, the second speaker, will be Livio Mattei. Livio is the provost of the Central European University, a private university. He's a professor of higher education policy. So Livio, sometimes you will have to declare yourself whether you speak as a higher education expert or as the provost of the private endowment funded CEU. CEU is specialized in social sciences mainly and has around 20 ERC grants, so it's, or even more, yeah. So it's a high-class private university, and everybody who's able to read newspapers knows about the terrible fate of CEU, who had to leave Hungary due to a number of measures, which we also might cover today, and is now situated mostly in Vienna and only with one branch in Hungary still. Christoph Gattringer, our third contributor and speaker, is to be welcomed as the new president of the Austrian Science Fund. I think he does it now for 3 months or 2 months, so very new in his position. But he had already the 24/7 task to install the Austrian Excellence Initiative for large grants, which finally, after I think 20 years of discussion, has been started in Austria now. Christoph Gattringer is a particle physicist with a long career in physics in various places around the world. His main station in the last 15 years has been the University of Graz, where he has been Dean and Vice Rector for Research. So as Livio and as Ole, he has also two viewpoints. One is university leadership, one is running a big funding organization. And last but not least, Maria, who will then also discuss what we heard from the three. We will have heard from the three gentlemen. Maria is, I know her already for quite a long time. We did even an EU project on early ERC impacts together, which I fondly remember. Maria is since 2004 Professor of Science and Innovation Dynamics and Policy at the University of Manchester. This is also your second viewpoint, is the UK viewpoint in our discussion. She's at the Manchester Institute of Innovation Research, has a lot of experience in science and organizing teacher there, and is also a visiting professor at the University of Lund. I stop here. I already overdid my minutes. Don't take the example from me to overdo your time. That's the privilege of the now shutting up moderator. Ole, your 6 minutes are starting now. Many thanks for being with us.
6 minutes for such a complex theme. I will certainly try to be as brief as possible to leave space for the debate, which I think is an important thing here. And what topic could be more timely and more important than exactly this particular topic, institutional autonomy in a very turbulent world. And I should say at the very beginning that the tension, Mikael, that you referred to between mission-driven research and more long-term blue sky research, I mean, this tension should not be overemphasized, because what do we see in this particular pandemic? I think the unsung heroes of this pandemic are the universities, the basic research. For instance, when we read about the vaccines in the newspapers, we are confronted, we are told that this is an achievement of the pharmaceutical companies. Obviously very important what the pharmaceutical companies did, but it all rests on basic science from our universities. Basic science of universities are the unsung heroes of the current pandemic. And this again tells us that you cannot really sort of single out mission-driven research as something completely different from basic research. The two lines of research that certainly converge. That is a very important thing, obviously. Then you said something that I think is highly relevant. Academic institutions, universities, they must thrive, and they cannot thrive unless they have ample institutional autonomy, so that they can carry out the tasks freely, independently, and with strategic autonomy. And then we are suddenly in the 3 points that I will try to bring to the table as possible points of departures for the debate. 3 short points. First, this debate that we have today contains a strong recommendation to the political authorities to resist the temptation to intervene. What I have seen as a rector over the past 12 years, first in Oslo and then in Karolinska Institute, is a sort of slippery slope towards more regulation, towards more interference from political authorities in our basic mission, in our tasks. This is extremely unfortunate because it tends to undermine the ultimate purpose for which universities were created and exist. So I hope we can get back to this. The second point is that we should avoid a fight for the strategic high ground. And now I look at Christoph because, you know, with the increased external funding that we see, not least in Sweden, there is also a fight for getting to the strategic high ground. The funding bodies, they are so extremely strong that they define much of the strategy in our sector. We have to really work out a sort of truce, a sort of, let's call it an agreement, so that there is not a number of generals, but that we as universities can be the general overall strategy. Strategy means originally the art of a general, and it's confusing when you have many generals for the same army. The third point is simply be vigilant in an area of geopolitical turbulence and in an area of political polarization, protectionism, and trends towards authoritarian governments. And I guess that Liviu will get back to this. What we are seeing now in documents even from the EU is a trend which is ominous in many ways, because these trends tell us that we should more than ever safeguard over autonomy. For example, if you read the communication from the Commission, EU Commission, to the European Parliament and the Council, dealing with the global approach to research and innovation, a document that has been discussed very much in the context of EUA. You see, for example, a sentence which portend perhaps increased political interference. It says here that the EU shall encourage universities to ensure a higher degree of reciprocity and mutual benefit in their cooperation with Chinese counterparts. Encourage is a mild word, but you know that it might lead in the wrong direction. Well, China is difficult, but we have to muster the competence ourselves to navigate in these difficult waters when it comes to international collaborations. This is also an aspect of autonomy. These were the 3 points. Thank you, and I hope I stuck to my time.
Perfect. Many thanks. And wonderful, as we have now, sorry, Ole, to cite football, but the Austrians also had to leave the team. It was the perfect pass to Hungary.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It is great to be in this group. I think it is very appropriate and very fitting that the organizers have chosen these 3 concepts to frame our discussion: funding, frameworks, and freedom, not because it just looks nice and they all start with F, and you can call them or the session 3F, but because these are all factors that are indeed needed for the successful, efficient, impactful, sustainable work of the university. I would nevertheless add a little bit to this framework, the 3 Fs. I think, for example, that by frameworks we can also understand the regulatory and policy frameworks, and then academic freedom is part of these frameworks rather than being a separate F. It is included in the framework F. And nevertheless, so other than frameworks and funding, and together with funding I will add resources, I think it is not unimportant to keep in mind when we think about the long-term sustainable efficient work of the university, to keep in mind another factor, which is people. So universities need frameworks, they need funding, but they need excellent people, committed people, students, academic staff member, and also administrative staff members. So it is a little bit 3F or 2F plus P from people that I would just briefly mention. Now, talking about frameworks and sustainability, I wanted to discuss briefly 2 questions using both my higher education researcher hat and my CEU hat, and I will be doing this by kind of illustrating more general considerations with CEU examples and other examples. And the 2 questions are, the first one, should frameworks be stable, perhaps even permanent, in order for sustainability to be achieved? So this is the first question. And the second question, who is responsible for developing enabling frameworks for universities to achieve sustainability, efficiency, and impact? And again, I will illustrate this a little bit with the CEU, some CEU and other examples. So to the question, should frameworks be stable? Yes. Can they be permanent? No. They shouldn't be permanent. There is a need to change frameworks, to adapt them to new realities, new challenges. And let me illustrate this with the entire discussion about academic freedom nowadays in Europe. So we have some kind of a European regulatory framework, an intellectual framework for academic freedom. But I also think that we have a crisis of academic freedom in Europe nowadays. And this is at the same time an intellectual crisis and a regulatory crisis, an empiric crisis, because the concept of academic freedom, the understanding of academic freedom is underdeveloped in Europe. We don't have a common conceptual reference for academic freedom in Europe. We don't have one conceptual reference that is adapted for our current times and realities, and we don't have one that is up to date. So there is a need to refresh this framework. And I'll give you just two examples here. What do I mean by the fact that we lack a common reference for academic freedom that is adapted, up to date, and useful? So you remember that the European Commission sued Hungary for infringement of academic freedom when Lex CEU was adopted. The Hungarian government reacted saying, you sue us based on what? There is no European legislation for academic freedom. There is no common notion of academic freedom. And the reaction of the European Commission and the court, the European Court of Justice, at first was, well, actually, you are right. This is a case not of academic freedom, but of delivery of commercial services. So it is not an infringement of academic freedom, but an infringement of the right to deliver commercial services under GATT. Well, so that shows a little bit that there was a lot of hesitation about what is academic freedom. I should say that in the final decision of the court, academic freedom was invoked with reference to the European Charter of Fundamental Rights, although there is no definition of academic freedom there either in this document. So we have a kind of rather vague by now and not up-to-date notion of academic freedom, which goes back to Humboldt, and it was very useful over the years. But we live in a new environment. We have a supranational context. We have the European higher education area with rules, regulations, principles, even institutions. And, academic freedom is not a matter only of national control. It's also a matter of exchanges. So, Norway has a wonderful law protecting academic freedom, but when a Norwegian student comes in an Erasmus exchange in Hungary, she cannot study gender studies because gender studies are forbidden here in Hungary. So we need a new frame of reference for academic freedom. And I should say some work is being done already. There is a statement adopted by the Bologna ministers in September with a kind of the beginning of a common European conceptual reference for academic freedom, and some work that is being done to create a European monitoring mechanism for fundamental values. It is the full name of the. So this is an example of how frameworks need to evolve. And it is a different question, of course, whose obligation is to develop these frameworks and put them in place. But let me go with this to the second question, which is directly about whose responsibility it is to have these frameworks. And of course, the question here is a little bit about the state. Is it the case that it is developing frameworks for university operations is the sole, if not only fundamental responsibility of the states? And we have seen during the COVID times that the state is not going away in higher education. With all developments in internationalization, the state continues to play and will continue to play a fundamental role and has very important obligation. And again, let me give you an example from something that we have experienced on our own skin, collective skin at CEU. We are probably the most internationally dense university in the world. In some classes, we don't have even 2 students from the same country. We have a relatively small number of students, but coming from 1,500, but coming from 110 plus countries of the world. The faculty is equally international, the staff. We don't have a national intellectual agenda, but we are not a stateless university. We cannot operate outside a state system. We need accreditation, we need protection. And when our problem started in Hungary, we tried to get protection from other states, New York State, United States, where we are chartered and accredited. It didn't quite work. But eventually, the Austrian authorities, the federal authorities, and the city authorities helped us, and then took us under their wing, and we are able to operate there. So it is not possible for any university, I will say, to operate outside the state, and it is the obligation of the state to create an enabling framework for universities and for higher education. Do they all do it? No. But then we can also ask the question, what is the role of the supranational level, because in Europe we have a really supranational set of regulations. So I understand I'm running out of time, and it's very interesting how this works. I'll just give one other example, going back to our profile as a private university. If the state has obligations, including with regard to funding, should the state fund private universities, right? And in a way, the answer here is simple. Funding of research, when successful, is in majority public. So if you think of all the great private American universities that we know, their funding is private for their educational activities mainly, but their funding is mainly public for their research. It is mainly public. Pentagon, Department of Agriculture. So, the great American research university has been built with public funding. And, we are also talking, in our case, CEU has 15% of our budget from the European Commission, all in competitive research funding. And it's a very interesting question that I would leave here about the responsibility of public authorities vis-a-vis funding private research, if not private education in private universities.
Thank you, Livio. I think this is an ideal pass over to the Austrian Mittelstürmer, Christoph Gattringer, who will now take over.
Yeah, thank you very much for your invitation to participate in this panel discussion. You actually asked me to address 3 questions in my opening statement. How can funding organizations safeguard long-term research agendas? How do ministries, funders, and universities speak to each other and build an agenda? Or should there be a common agenda at all, which has been questioned already by the previous speakers? And you wanted me to comment also a little bit on the specific Austrian situation with quite small funding budgets, but many research key players. So let me begin a little bit with the long-term research agenda. I think most of us will agree that many questions in modern research have an intrinsic very long time scale. One example was mentioned by Ole. Developing a COVID vaccine is not something that happened in the last 1.5 years by some pharmaceutical company. It goes back to ideas from fundamental research that were started being developed 15 years ago. And we can all name other examples. Building a quantum computer is something with a very long time scale, or developing further treatment for a specific type of cancer would be another example. And I think the basic strategy for securing long-term funding for research has to be that there is a common understanding that for fundamental research, it simply takes a long time to come up in the end with results, and often you don't know what exactly this result will be. Another side remark, the techniques, mRNA techniques that are used in COVID, in some of the COVID vaccines, were developed for fighting cancer, and then it turned out you can use the techniques for applications in these COVID vaccinations. So it's a long time frame, and this has to be a common understanding, otherwise the system will not work. But once it's clear that fundamental research has this long time scale, then of course also the funding has to be set up in a way that it matches this long time scale. And this has 2 sides. So we, as the National Funding Organization, we get our funds from the Ministry of Research, also the Ministry of Finance, of course. And if we are convinced that we need this long time scale, we also have to convince our funders that they implement the budget in this time scale. And in Austria, we have made a step forward in this direction of securing long-time funding. The FWF for the first time now has a 3-year budget. We used to have 1-year budgets. So we have a 3-year budget with a preview for another follow-up period of 3 years. So we can start to plan in more long-term periods which are necessary to fund these big questions in science, which have this long-term time scale. This is one side of the medal. The other side is, of course, that also our research portfolio must have components that allow for long-term projects. And I guess we will later talk a little bit about this Austrian Excellence Initiative, where we now have also program elements with a time scale of up to 10 years and quite substantial funding for these long periods. And I really think this is necessary for many modern research questions. You invited me to also comment on the questions: how do ministries, funders, universities speak to each other, and should they have a common agenda? I think for some aspects, it's absolutely essential that we have a common agenda, a common understanding. For example, on the question, what are the proper timescales? And if the people involved in the research system, which is the researchers, the universities, the funding agencies, the ministries, if they don't have a common understanding how the system should work, what are the goals, what are the timelines, it's not going to work properly. So I'm convinced on many aspects we should have a joint agenda. But what is also clear, that for me as the president of a foundation that sponsors fundamental research, there can be no agenda on what the research topics are. Not for our funding agencies. There is a second twin organization in Austria with much more applied, topically driven research programs. But this is a different business, not the FWF. For us, these topically open programs are really essential. And I think most universities will agree on this. You wanted me to comment also a little bit on the specific Austrian situation, in particular, what concerns this long time scale, also strategic positioning. So my impression at the moment is a little bit that Austria has not found the optimal balance concerning the discrepancy between cooperation and strategic positioning. And I think this balance is very important. There has to be cooperation. Large research infrastructure is very expensive. It better be used jointly. There are many synergies that could be lifted by cooperation, but also strategic positioning, competition is very important. It's one of the driving forces of excellent research. Still, I think that the openness for cooperation is not as developed in Austria as I would like to see it, but I see some steps that go into the right direction. And you invited me also to reflect a little bit on my experience in one of my previous roles. And I would like to briefly describe something which I really think is a success story in terms of long-term cooperation and making good use of infrastructure. Is what is called the Natural Science Navi Graz cooperation. It's a cooperation between the Technical University in Graz and the General University in Graz. It started more than 15 years ago, and it applies to all institutes in the field of natural sciences. And over these 15 years, joint curricula were developed, many joint research projects were started, joint infrastructure was acquired, jointly used. And this is culminating at the moment in a new institute building for all physics institutes in Graz. It's a big complex costing several €100 million. And I really think this is a very nice example how institutions can cooperate, but still also allow for competition. Of course, within the discipline, there will be competition between the various groups, but making much better use of the infrastructure and lifting all the synergies that are possible for better PhD training, a larger study program that can be offered to incoming students, etc. And with this excellence initiative, which the FWF is about to implement, as has been mentioned by Michael Stampfer, we will try to allow for more of these large-scale cooperations to lift the synergies that are possible, that I at least see in the Austrian research system. So far, my opening statement.
Super, many thanks, Christoph Gattringer. We will come back to some of your points in the discussion. And I would like for 1 minute deviate from the original order, and would like to put one question to you before Maria then comes in with her intervention, if this is okay for you, Maria, because most of you talked about the, or most of the talking now was of outer world versus universities, but I would like to take up the opening statement of Ole, and one of the questions who are already here in the chat. I invite now everybody to fiercely write questions into the chat as fodder for our discussion about the long-term academic research running up to the mRNA vaccines. And there's the formerly unknown person of Katalin Karikó, a Hungarian-born American researcher who fought mainly 20 years against her university, that she was allowed within her university to do some mRNA research. She even lost, I think, her tenured position or something like that. It's a real tragic story. And only after 20 years of perseverance, she proved successfully with third-party funding. So the question more nicely put from one person in the audience, as we hear the case for autonomy of institutions, where do we stand with regard to autonomy of researchers within institutions? And I would like all of you, starting with Herr Gattringer, then Livio, then Ole, say one sentence about that. And Maria, this is then your opening signal for your statement. Yeah, but I would like in the first block also to the university researchers and universities are no innocent places. Even as an outsider to universities, I can clearly identify that. And I would like all three of you and then Maria to give only in 1 or 2 sentences to say something that we can include that in our discussion also.
Okay, then I maybe jump into the cold water. I can only say autonomy of researchers is absolutely important. It is really a key to success. However, as you said, this is not an easy topic. It's often mixed up in other questions like a limited lab space, competition for who gets to use the lab. It's not always easy to disentangle that, but there's no question autonomy of researchers is absolute key.
Livio, in the same crisp way.
Yes. So I think it is very important, personally, I believe, to distinguish between university autonomy, which is a set of freedoms of the institution, rectors, deans, provosts, like me, institution, and academic freedom, which is the freedom of individuals in the institution. And yes, there are internal threats to academic freedom as there are external threats to both, and it is very important to take this into account. In Europe, we have a model, a European model for university autonomy. We don't have a model for academic freedom.
Okay. Ole, the second question from the audience goes in the same, you can perhaps perfectly answer. The autonomy of researchers within institutions is related to their research field, and much of the medical research is a highly delicate business with human bodies and health and huge damage that also can take place. So perhaps you could also comment from your side.
Yeah, first of all, it's an interesting question. difference between academic freedom and institutional autonomy, I think it's essential that we keep these two terms apart because they relate to different things. When it comes to institutional autonomy, obviously, it means that the institution has the right to decide freely and independently, I would like to say, how to perform the tasks. When it comes to academic freedom, of course, this pertains to the individual. So it's on a different level. But I should be very, very honest. We must not be naive. It happens, and I dare say quite often. Perhaps it's happened even in my own institution, that there is an interference or conflict between the two terms. And it's easy to see that an excessive autonomy on the part of the university leadership could undermine individual autonomy and academic freedom. But then enter what I think is so important. I'm sure Liv, you agrees with me. Institutional autonomy is not directly equivalent to the autonomy of the university leadership. The university leadership should see the university as a collegium, as an academic society, where there are bottom-up processes that ensure that whatever decision is made is not a decision made top-down only by the university leadership. So these two things, they can be reconciled if we go back in history and are loyal to what a university should be, a collegium, a community where voices are heard, also bottom-up. Thank you.
Thank you for this important point on which we will come back twice. First today in our discussion, but this is also, I think, a very fruitful idea for a discussion around in at ESOF 22. Thank you for that, Ole. Maria, now it's your turn with a little later than envisioned, but you are
Mikael,
now.
do I have 10 minutes?
You have 10 minutes, exactly. Okay. 10. Exactly
because I'm
10.
timing myself, so I'm not
10. Time yourself. Great.
I'm a woman of many words, as you well know. So now I would like first to thank Mikael and the organizers of this session for the opportunity to be here and to listen to you and to talk to you and to possibly debate with you. And next, I would like to start by making 3 brief statements. The first is that I wouldn't be Maria Nedeva if I'm not provocative. So I see my task as ensuring sufficient level of provocation to engender useful debate. And next, I always like to kind of contribute something that people are not likely to know. So here are my 2 pieces with which I want to start. The first is that not many people realize that in ancient China, there were 2 kinds of people men, of course, people at this time were men mainly, who were allowed to wear their hair down. You know, they used to wear this men ponytail thing that has become fashionable lately, but there were 2 kinds of men who were allowed to wear their hair down. People who were mad, clinically mad, and the scientists, right? So this probably tells us something about the level of freedom that is traditionally considered necessary for intellectual pursuits, unbridled by convention and rules. And the next thing I want to remind you, which came already from this discussion, that Janis Joplin in one of her songs said that freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose. And I would like us to remember that all participants in this knowledge processes have too much to lose for us to talk about freedom in the classical Chinese sense of this word. Okay, so having said this, I also would like to emphasize that I listened to the previous 3 contributions with great interest, because they confirmed something we sociologists of science have known for a long time, that there are considerable differences in different types of notions that operate depending on types of fields. Already mentioned this in the questions, types of fields, as well as local and broadly cultural tradition. So we heard first Oli's contribution, which was fascinating because academic freedom, or the university autonomy and academic freedom, both were taken for granted. It is something that we have and nobody gives us. Therefore, nobody has the right to take it away. So broadly, my interpretation of your three key points were warnings of infringements to this rule, that nobody can take away or should aspire to take away something that academic organizations and people already have and have had. Then we heard from Livio, who exposed somewhat different underlying assumptions, namely that autonomy and freedom is something that is given or is taken, but it's not there. It is not a structural arrangement, as, for example, I would believe, which basically makes us think about the very profound cultural traditions in different parts of Europe. Okay, so and probably we can discuss about this a bit more, but Livio raised very interesting questions around the fact that freedom or autonomy can be something that is limited. It is limited by the state. How do we cope? In my mind, this question also translated in, is it a state per se, or it can be other socio-political context. So, for example, can the European Union structures that were put in place be a proxy for state and provide the necessary frameworks for universities to operate, right? Or a region, right? Now, this also, and I apologize here, but I did warn you about the provocation thing. It made me question whether, for example, a country where people believe that kind of studying particular subjects can be prohibited, like gender studies, is the place where we can at all raise issues about organizational autonomy, science, etc., etc. Basically, we can think, okay, culturally, this society is not sufficiently developed to warrant such a debate, because you cannot have a debate. Because if somebody can tell you what to think, they're not prepared to openly debate issues around that. That is kind of, so we can think of it in terms of politically closed and open mindsets, right? And I also would like for the audience to kind of mention something that I've been thinking a lot about. Can I ask, is Hungary Catholic? No. Is it Protestant?
Both, half plus some more.
Yeah, the reason I'm asking is because traditionally I've always believed that actually Protestant places have much more open cultures, and through the industrious spirit that Protestantism brought, they kind of learned to award much better significance to autonomy and freedom. Anyway, now the issues that we may need to discuss about balance. I'm moving to what Christoph raised, right? So in any funding system, and this is the second overall question of the topic, in any funding system, there are generally two modes of public funding. And I'll get back to the public funding and what Livio was saying about the funding of universities. They are selective and competitive. So block grants are selective because usually there's some form of judgment as to how much and what to whom to award these grants in most countries. There are very few countries where it's some simple formula at the moment, or competitive, which is project-based funding. Now, the proportions of the public funding between these two modalities varies very widely across Europe and across the world. Now, generally, science policy experts, and I'm putting this in inverted commas, go around the world going, oh yes, competition good, block grants bad. So we advise a lot of emerging kind of economies and countries, mainly in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, to scrap their baseline selective funding and go for fully competitive or mostly competitive funding, which, by the way, quite a few of them do, and find that that is complete rubbish. And we have to call a spade a spade. Why? Because actually the selective funding or the baseline funding gives organizations the stability, which was raised by both Oli and Livio, they need to kind of progress knowledge and education. And the competitive funding is the layer that gives us variance, that actually eventually shifts knowledge lines in different fields, right? Now, in terms of, I've done a study, by the way, of that, and the most innovative, two of the most innovative countries in the world have up to 80% baseline grants to their universities, and they're Switzerland and Israel. Okay, so I rest my case on this one, but we can continue doing. Now, when we talk about funding, particularly public funding, we have to talk about priorities, right? Because, Christoph, you also raised this in your intervention. You were saying that your basic foundation kind of doesn't affect, or you wish to think that it doesn't affect topic selection, but at the same time, when you report about what you've done to the ministries and other state bodies, they usually want to know what is the bang for their buck, what has been achieved with the funding. And we reach priorities. And here, Livio, and I will end with this, and a great provocation, I would like to tell you that my research team looked at how the labs at Oxford University who developed AstraZeneca vaccine were funded. And I have to tell you that over the last 15 years or so we looked, they received relatively little public funding. And do you know why? Now, they were generously funded, but they were funded by private foundations. They were funded by the Wellcome Trust. They were funded by the Gates Foundation. They were funded by the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. And surprise, surprise, I didn't know, but the rich people who meet at Davos to eat cakes and talk stuff actually have started a foundation for biomedical research, which is supposed to deal with issues of the world. Why? Because these labs worked traditionally on issues that were not priority for the UK. They worked on malaria, they worked on coronaviruses, but they were spread. These coronaviruses were spread in some weird camel herding peoples in Mongolia and in sugar cane cutters somewhere else in the world, right? And they were not our problem. So why would we put public funding in that? There is no bang for our buck. And this is something I believe we should pay very serious attention when we talk about funding, frameworks, and autonomy. And really, last sentence, Mikael, here. Institutional autonomy and academic freedom. Oli, you're completely correct that they tend to influence each other. And in the UK, I repeatedly see cases where top places still recruit absolutely stellar researchers and academics, and then through interference from the university, linked to our particular evaluation system, we make this extremely extraordinary people into extremely boring and ordinary thinkers, right? Because what happens, and I've started thinking and talking about chain of effects, if you have strong evaluation systems within the country or region, what happens is that they send different signals which university leadership reads in different ways. Sometimes probably not, they don't read the signal that was intended, but that is only human and organizationally acceptable. So then they actually start putting under pressure the employees, including academics of the organization. So in our case, this means that people are continuously advised to publish in particular journals because this favors high rankings in the evaluation system. That's me done. Thank you very much. And I'm sorry I overrun by
wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Ole, I was drawn 2 years ago into a Swedish discussion about the proportions between third-party funding and block grants. There was a large government review, of which you know more than I, where a number of people from traditional universities and the number of people of the underfed regional, research-wise underfed regional universities teamed up and said, hey, we don't have enough block grants. We have too many societal tasks because there's no Max Planck and Fraunhofer in Sweden, and there are 20 research funders and foundations where we cannot build strategies because there are so many short-term different signals. So perhaps this is a kind of story where you could come in, and then I have a slightly different question to Christoph Gattringer.
Yes, and first, thanks to Maria. I think it's very, very important to have your provocative attitude to this, because we really need to be self-critical also when it comes to these issues. Absolutely. Yes, when it comes to your specific question, and it's interesting, Maria, that you mentioned Israel and which was the other country? I don't remember. Israel and Switzerland, yes, as being the most innovative, or among the most innovative countries, and having generous block funding or core funding. But I dare say Sweden is also near the top of the list when it comes to innovative power, according to most rankings. Yet in Sweden, and specifically my own institution, we really are extremely dependent on third-party funding, external funding. For my own institution, Karolinska Institute, just 40% of the funding comes as core funding from the government. And this has everything to do with what we are discussing now, institutional autonomy, because, you know, loyalty is coupled to the flow of money, obviously. And, you know, this is accentuated in Sweden. And now I address this to Christoph, because not only do external funding bodies figure prominently when it comes to the support of science, but the grants come with a requirement for co-financing from the universities. So that means that for every grant, Christoph, we get from a funding body like yours, we have to take some of our own core funding to add to the external funding, which hollows out what is the core for our autonomy, and that is the basic funding. So you see, the discussion that we have now is so important. We have it on the national scene. It should be on the European scene, because it's a question of what I said, the fight for the strategic high ground. And the development in Europe is that this fight for the strategic high ground is more and more going towards a victory for the funding bodies rather than for the universities. I'm putting this to the point, but it's a very important question that is very often neglected. Thank you.
Which is very often neglected, and we also have to have a look who is writing the research bills. In Sweden, the funding organizations have a very strong role in writing the 4-year research bills for the ministry. Yeah? So there's a kind of recurring trajectory which is going on. On the other hand, there was in Sweden also the discussion how prepared universities are, and Karolinska might be an exception there because you are strategically very fit. How able are universities to devise strategies and recruit the right people and give them a clear career trajectory. So there's quite some crossfire here going on. Before I ask Christoph Gattringer on to comment this and on answer a question I have to him, Maria, a very short intervention from your side.
Yes, I remembered, and thank you very much, Oli, because you're absolutely correct. But how this works and how the positioning works is very research field dependent. And this applies also to the dichotomy between institutional autonomy and intellectual freedom, or academic freedom. So what we're finding is that what I call global fields, most of particle physics, and these are astronomy, this kind of thing, they're organized around very large facilities that are outside organizations and sometimes nations. And the level of intellectual autonomy is unbelievable because the rules of the field trump the rules of the organization. But that is not the case with what I refer to local fields, which are most fields in biosciences, with few exceptions, of course, and some fields in physics, the lab-based ones, so-called atom whatever tubes, I even forget the name, in such field, and the autonomy is very strongly restricted. So for example, people from heavy flavor physics, which is global field, say, yeah, our university tells us to pay in science, to publish in Science and Nature, but we don't, because we have our journals, and these are the journals of my field. But cold atom people who are from local field go, oh yes, and we publish in Science and Nature, and it is so many points, and if I don't publish in Science and Nature, I will lose my glassblower, and without my glassblower, I can't do science.
Without my glassblower, I can't do science. I think this will be, if I ever write about these things, I will take this as for the headline. Christoph Gattringer, first of all, as a president of a science research council, you have to react to that. But I would like also to hand over one of the questions from the audience to you, which I won't read it because it's quite a long question, but about the specific situation of the young people, the postdocs, the early stage researchers, who are often cruelly trapped, and the word cruel is also in one of the questions, between hyper competition and institutional insecurity and other challenges, where universities obviously, and I will hand that later over also to Livio this question, are not the best places in the world also to prepare early stage researchers for careers in the non-university world. Yeah, and most of the early stage researchers will not become senior researchers at the university. Yeah, so Christoph Gattringer first on the two issues, Research Council President answered to the momentarily absent Ole Ottersen, but we will, here he is, okay. So, and second, the early stage issue, which will leave you, please just then take up the ball and go on with that.
Yeah, thank you very much. So Ole, when I heard about your budget situation, I was very much surprised, I must say, that you had this balance of only 40% basic funding, core funding, and the rest third-party funding. I was really surprised to hear about this ratio because I guess in Austria this is quite different. So of course there's a wide spectrum, but I guess for some of the arts-based universities, the basic funding is near to 100%. More applied universities, technical universities have a lot of third-party funding also from industry projects, but still we are far away from a balance of 40 to 60 as you have it. And I understand that if you have such a large fraction of third-party funding, that the funding organizations then have a really large impact of how you conduct your work in the various universities. So this is different in Austria. But of course, this contribution of the universities to big funding lines, this is a very important issue, which also plays a significant role in this excellence initiative, these excellence clusters, which we are implementing at the moment. For these clusters, we expect that the contributing universities, it's always a team of at least 3 universities or other research institutions, that they contribute 40% of the overall budget with their own contributions. But for me, it was important to offer a wide spectrum of different elements, how this contribution can be brought into the project. And we allowed for various different options, taking into account previous investment, but also allowing for researchers a teaching reduction, which you then can convert into euros and use for building up these 40% contributions of your own. I think it's important to have this contribution of the universities, because I also spoke about timescales. We are aiming really at long-term commitment for a 10-year period, maybe even longer. And so it's important to involve the universities. But for me, it's also key to allow the universities to build up a package of measures which are really tailor-made to the discipline and really aim at what they try to achieve with such a big cluster of excellence. So this is one statement I wanted to make, and I learned a lot, and I was really surprised to see how large the fraction of third-party funding is in your institution. Maybe very briefly, I would also like to pick up the invitation from Michael Stampfer to comment a little bit on the situation of postdocs, which originally came from a contribution in the chat, which I also read with great interest. I really think this is a very important aspect, and as in my previous position as vice rector at the University of Graz, we started something which a project which is called Postdoc Initiative, and let me tell you a little bit about this project, because I really think it's very important. Why did we get interested in postdocs? Postdocs at the University of Graz, they're something like 12% or so of the academic workforce of the university. But our analysis indicates that the contribution to the scientific output of this group is considerably higher than this 12%. Why is this so? Because postdocs typically don't spend time in committees. They have relatively little teaching obligations. They are at the height of their productivity, and they really do research around the clock, very highly motivated. So they are a very important resource. On the other hand, as we all agree, I guess the postdoc part of an academic career is a very vulnerable part. It is characterized by often changing the workplace. I worked at 3 different universities, institutions during my postdoc career. There's insecurity. You don't have this long-term perspective, which you have once you're tenured. And often it's also the time of funding a family. So a very complicated, vulnerable part of an academic career. And the goal of this postdoc initiative was to support postdocs in this complicated period of their life, but also try to better tap onto the resource, the important intellectual resource which is provided by the work of the postdocs. And maybe since Maria had several interesting anecdotes, I also tell you an anecdote. When we started this project, we tried to find out how many postdocs are there at the University of Graz, and nobody could tell me. It was not possible. So I started to ask various people, and the answers differed by a factor of 20. So the reply I got were between, maybe we have 50 postdocs, and others said, at least 1,000. So there was really literally a factor of 20. And this also clearly tells you that the role of the work of the postdocs, or the role of the postdocs, is not sufficiently appreciated if an institution doesn't even know how many people work in this category. So this was my quick input to this invitation by Michael Stampfer to say also something about this very vulnerable category of postdoctoral researchers. And at this point, I also have to excuse myself. In 5 minutes, I have to report to one of my supervision bodies, namely the Assembly of Delegates, and I have to be there in exactly 4 minutes from now. It was a very interesting discussion. I learned a lot. I found all the other statements very interesting. They helped me also to reflect a little bit about my role, to think about my positions. Thank you very much for this very interesting hour. Thank you.
Thank you. And you have now identified yourself as a contributor to next year's discussion at ESOF 22, in what role ever. Many thanks for that, Christoph Gatringer. We meet somewhere in Vienna.
Sure.
Livio, take over, and while you order your thoughts, there's a wild discussion in the chat, which we will not, where we won't come with the universal formula in the next 3 minutes, about ultra selectivity in research funding, and the perverse, the more selective, the more excellent, the more, I don't know what, Materialschlacht, fight with a lot of resources for dwindling results. We can only say we will not forget it and also take it up in another EuroScience thread. So, Livio.
Yes, thank you. So I'll take the gauntlet from Maria, and I'll, continue to be provocative, but I mean everything that I say, and it is good we are online, because at least for one of the things I'm going to say, probably people will want to kill me. So the first comment is that the key to university autonomy is in the hand of the state everywhere. In spite of everything, the state can turn it on, can turn it off. When it turns it off, it is not for cultural reasons. They matter, but that's not the most important thing. It is for ideological reasons. It is a matter of nature of political regime. Hungary, that now is forbidding gender studies, was the same culturally 10, 15 years ago, when it was one of the most liberal countries in Europe in that regard. So culture hasn't changed. The regime has changed. Second comment, it is true that private funding for research in higher education is increasing in Europe. There is more money from foundations in Europe for research every year than from ERC. That is true. But it doesn't mean that public funding doesn't remain a majority. And as I said, even in the United States, more than half of the research and development funding comes from federal funding, not just any public funds, but only private funds. It is very interesting. Private universities, do they fund research themselves? For-profit private universities, never, basically. You cannot fund research from tuition. It is too expensive. So that's why we don't see any for-profit university in any ranking, because they don't do research. Now, those not-for-profit universities, they fund it from endowment, when they have one like us, from donations, from foundations, from grants, and it is a question: how can you fund sustainably research in a private university? And perhaps this applies to public universities as well. We have an excellent department of cognitive science. Every faculty member in that department had 1-2 ERC grants, but then they cannot live forever from ERC grants. They will not get ERC. It's not possible. So what do we do? How do we fund it? Well, we can fund the salaries from endowment, but we cannot find the postdocs, the lab assistants, so that it is a pressure on us as university leadership to find the money from a variety of sources. Now Austria, both the federal fund and the city fund are very supportive for that. But it is a challenge, and there are different models. And finally, early stage researchers. I think this is, I don't have the time really to elaborate.
Yeah, you have less time than you think, Livio. So one sentence.
No, these PhD students are PhD students. They are there to learn primarily. Not all of them will become any type of researchers, though the obligation of the university is to train, to educate them for lives, for careers, which might include research. But for some PhD programs, less than 5% of the graduate of that program will ever become researchers or do research. It is a mistake to talk about PhD students as early stage researchers.
Thank you very much. Before I do the following now, I say first thank you to all, but don't leave us. My second thing is that I'm looking at history. I'm no optimist. The University of Vienna was for 150 years in the hand of the Jesuit order. Yeah, so there might be long periods of very specific intellectual frameworks. I don't want to say whether it's good or not, but specific it's anyhow. Maria, you have one famous wisecrack at the end. It's already 1 minute after 1. So give us the last flavor to this session.
Oh, no, I think I surprised even myself with without my glass blow, I can't do my research. So let's leave it at that. And
okay.
think about the differences in conditions for different fields. I actually think exactly that science governance should move away from outcomes and results to enabling conditions for people who do research to do what they do best.
Mm-hmm. Higher education policy often reminds us of horses who have galloped too long and now have this kind of foam on the snout. So a little less fast might also do. Three things. I adored this discussion. Many thanks. Great speakers, Maria, Livio, Ole, Christoph, many thanks. Second, you are a great audience, and I'm not EuroScience, but Michael Matlos will say, the EuroScience president will say something in a minute. All the things you have written on excellence, on young people, on the grueling treadmill you are all in, will not be lost and will be taken as inspiration for next year's ESOF discussions.